Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carla Legria, Project Manager with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar, Family-Centered Toolkit for Domestic Violence Programs and Overview, Part 2, Best Practices and Program Guidance on Supporting Children, Teens, and Their Families, will be presented by Susan Blumenfeld and Jeannette Baca. Before we get started, I would like to go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are a couple boxes. Towards the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat icon on the bottom right of your screen to open your chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in touch with the presenter if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact me if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. And to do this, you could click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select everyone. If you would like to respond to a question from the presenter or to contact center staff anytime during the session. You should click on me, Carla, to privately contact me if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on everyone, type in where you're calling from, and then press enter. Excellent. Thank you very much for helping me see that. While you can get a lot of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. And if this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with that same arrow. Time permitting, there will be, we'll moderate a question and answer in the chat box. And at the very end of the webinar, we'll share a brief survey in the chat. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connectivity, so feel free to call back in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact me, you can call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issue. That phone number, which I'll post in the chat, is 866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Carla. I had a little moment there where it gave me a little pause to unmute myself. Welcome, everybody, and thank you, Carla, for the tech intro. We're so happy that you're back for part 2. If you're joining us for the first time, we already have archived the part 1 that we did last Wednesday, and you can get the recording and get our PowerPoint slides set. In part 1, we offered an introduction to the entire toolkit with emphasis on how the toolkit may be used to build organizational capacity for family-centered services. Today, we'll be focusing more specifically on programming and best practices around responding to the needs of children, teens, and their caregivers. And we're also going to demonstrate how you might choose to apply one of the learning vignettes that we have throughout the toolkit. So I'm Susan, and Jeannette is my co-collaborator and co-author on this toolkit that we are pretty proud to be launching. And so we'll take it from there. Okay, if you are unfamiliar with us, we are a federally funded resource center, training and TA center that's based in Chicago. And we support programs and strive to improve systems capacity to meet the complex needs of domestic violence survivors and their families. And there are lots of different components of our work. We particularly look at the intersection between domestic violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. If you haven't checked us out before, there's really a wealth of resources that we have that are archived that might be helpful to you in your work. This just tells you a little bit about our funder and the disclaimer. Okay, and we like to start all of our trainings, or I like to start them anyway, by just inviting everybody to take a moment to center with our breath. So I'd like to invite you to just get into a comfortable posture if you're seated or standing. And if you so choose, you can close your eyes. You may choose to glance downwards, or you can focus on the stones in the picture. So just tune in a little bit to how your breath is right now, and maybe invite your breath into your diaphragm, into our bellies, just whatever pace you're at. And then when you're settled, we're going to take 3 deep breaths in through our nose, and then we're going to exhale out through our mouth with an audible This can be at your own pace and whatever feels deep for you. And this varies from person to person and for each of us from breath to breath. When you exhale, see if you can hold it a little longer than the in-breath. So almost like we'll lead you into the next breath that you're going to take in through your nose. So when you're ready, and if you want to join me, we'll start now. So here we go with breath 1. And if your eyes were closed, you can open them, glance back at the screen. And I just think with how rushed and hurried our lives are and stressful, it's just a really helpful reminder to pause, to breathe. And it's such a good antidote to stress. Okay, with that, we're going to start the rest of our presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeannette.
Thanks, Susan. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Susan said, today is part 2 of our introduction to our family-centered toolkit for domestic violence programs. Just a quick note of apology. We had hoped that the toolkit would be available last week, and it wasn't. The links needed a little bit of work, but today the toolkit is available. And I know I was able to download it this morning, so that was really exciting. And I believe that Carla will be putting a direct link to the toolkit into chat. And do know that it's available on the National Center's website today. So that's very exciting for us. Next slide, Susan. So for today's webinar, we will be covering sections 5, 6, and 7 of the toolkit. So these sections address best practices for family-centered services and responding to children and teens' unique needs. We will be sharing one of the vignettes. It's working with Marcus and his mom from the toolkit to really demonstrate how to integrate the learning and the content of the toolkit with practice, right? And practicing with a client situation. So at the end of the webinar, we're going to have time for questions for sure. And Carla will also be posting a brief survey at the end of today's session. So let's talk a little bit about what is in section 5. So this section offers guidance on the initial stages of engaging children and families in our services. So we share ideas in the toolkit for the intake process and how to support families by creating choices. And really, you know, we recognize the need to be flexible while meeting some of the paperwork requirements of our funders or some of the organizational requirements. So we offer some suggestions on building rapport with families and some developmentally sensitive questions to get to know children and teens as they are entering our services. For example, not only do we want to ask questions of children and teens about like their school experiences and their favorite hobbies, we also want to make sure that we're asking questions to get a fuller idea of the child's understanding of the domestic violence and also their family's need for reaching out for services at our organizations. We recognize that for many families seeking our services, they may have never before disclosed the family violence, and this may be seen as violating some type of family rule by talking about it. And so sometimes the questions that we might ask on intake can feel invasive to families. And so we really want to stress the need to build relationships with families and children so that we can ask those important questions to really help us understand the unique experiences of families and to better understand how we can serve them. So this section of the toolkit, section 5, also provides 2 safety planning templates. And these can be customized to meet the unique needs of your organization and also the families and children that you serve. So we know that safety planning is an ongoing fluid activity. We want to be continually reviewing and modifying safety plans with children and their caregivers. And obviously we're making changes, right, as their circumstances and their situation changes. Section 5 also addresses issues of confidentiality and referrals. So for confidentiality, we bring attention to sharing information within organizations and also sharing information with those who are working outside of our organization. We also bring attention to how we can prepare for potential issues that might come up in serving families, especially when advocates and therapists are seeing children without the caregiver being present. It can be very important to establish in advance with the child and the caregiver what will be shared following those sessions, and to make sure that children and their caregivers are well aware of that prior to meeting with families. In terms of referrals and connecting with community members, we know that direct service domestic violence staff are often very well networked in their communities with adult serving agencies. And so what we wanted to really offer in this section were ideas about connecting with resources that might be a little bit more child and family focused and might be a little bit more off the radar. In many communities, we realize that advocates know which medical providers will see someone quickly, or they're connected with healthcare for the homeless to serve adults that are in their services. And do we know pediatricians that can see the children? Same thing goes for dentists, right? We know the adult dentists in our communities, and do we know a pediatric dentist that might see a kiddo quickly? So we really want to highlight infant and early childhood mental health providers and also daycare centers as important child serving resources, along with others. Next slide, Susan, please. So now we're hoping to ask you a little bit about using an integrated approach when initially engaging families. And please consider the question on this slide and feel free to type your responses into the chat box. But when meeting families' needs and serving families and being more family-centered, what should we consider during our initial engagement and intake process with families? Again, please feel free to put it in chat if you've got thoughts on this. Cultural differences. Thank you, Desiree. Absolutely. What community they might be coming from. Is their culture represented within the organization? Do they feel comfortable seeking services? Mutal says parents, and in some cases children or teens, may have preconceived notions about therapy in general. Absolutely. And also about what shelter means. If you're providing residential services, if you're providing non-residential services, what does that look like? What does therapy entail? Have they participated in therapy before? Have they sought services at a shelter before? Patricia says, all families are unique and family norms vary. Absolutely. And so having questions that we are asking survivors and their children about their family so that we can better understand those unique aspects of their family system. Hannah says, with kids especially who have already spoken to, how many times have they had to repeat themselves with certain processes or information sharing? Absolutely. Like really being conscientious about not asking children to share the same story over and over again. That can be re-traumatizing for kids, if I'm understanding you, Hannah.
I'll jump in. So Amy was talking about how children and parents may have different experiences and different needs, and how do we support them so that everybody has a voice in the process? Yes, thank you. Deborah's saying, how do we look at the current family dynamics and context from both the perspective of the adult and the child? As he's saying, who is a source of referral and what's the family makeup? Yeah, those are all excellent. Generational differences in a family. Yes, first generation immigrants and those that are born here. Excellent. Bianca, hopes and fears, preferences or accommodations. And so what comes to mind for me, Jeannette, is thinking about the fact that we can be sensitive to what it's like to be separated at the point of engagement or intake with your program. So if it's a young child, really being sensitive to what are their fears about being separated from their parent or caregiver. And Bianca's comment made me think about that. What kinds of accommodations can sometimes kids can be within eyeshot of their parent or caregiver, or we can figure out when we're going to have more sensitive adult conversations. All good comments. Yeah. Jeannette, will you, let's see.
Yeah, I was just looking at Mutal was also sharing there's lots of anxiety at times, right? And in some cases, aspects of vulnerability. And so we need to be taking care of ourselves as well and stay grounded. And something just I thought of was also just gaining that permission to talk with children and teens and making sure that we have permission from that caregiver, and also that the caregiver has offered that permission and supported the children in answering our questions and talking with us about what's going on in their family system.
Yeah, and I think to follow up a little bit to what Mutal was pointing out, thinking about, and I think we talk about this in the section, pacing our questions and the information and really gauging what's the survivor state of mind as we start to explore some of this information. And I think a number of you were talking about, where are they at when they're coming in? This can be a really difficult time for folks. But so important in terms of setting a trauma-informed frame that says, we're here for you, our services are going to be inclusive, we're going to look at and be sensitive to and try to accommodate your needs. And we understand that just coming for services, depending on the circumstance, may be kind of loaded for people. Anything else?
Yeah, no, go ahead, Susan. I was just thanking folks for participating.
Okay. All right. You may have other thoughts that come through. And we also noted on this slide that we also talk about in section 4, which we mentioned last time, we talk about creating a welcoming, family-friendly environment. And so, thinking from the child's perspective and the family's perspective, do I see me in this place? Do I feel comfortable? Are things at child's eye level? What's seen? What does it look like? How welcoming is it? And so that's all part of that initial engagement process and taking an integrated approach. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking about what's in section 6. And section 6 has a very long title. In this particular section, incorporating knowledge about attachment, child development, trauma and healing, and how do we incorporate that into family-centered services. And when we were putting the toolkit together, we developed this section in response to what we've heard over the years from domestic violence advocates and programs about what would be helpful to know and what frameworks, resources, and integrated approaches have been useful and helpful in working with families. We have some favorite resources that we've developed over the years, but we've also updated them. So I would say that this section is highly recommended for new staff and volunteers, and for domestic violence staff who might need a refresher in this area, or who want to go deeper in exploring more specific resources. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what's in this section, and you can kind of see some of the main points on this slide. So we begin by talking about the importance of attachment relationships with caregiving adults and developing secure attachments. And we also give some summary about attachment theory and research. We think is really important because so much of our development when we're little and growing really is scaffolded, oh, that was a mouthful, by our caregiving adults that are around us and surrounding us. Some of you may already be familiar with the circle of security model that was developed by Hoffman, Cooper, and Powell in the Spokane, Washington area. Some of you, like myself and Jeannette, have been trained in that approach. And what the founders did was they took attachment theory and developmental research and put it into an accessible graphic that can be shared with caregivers and adapted in culturally sensitive ways. And so within this section, we provide the graphic and a link to a short YouTube video that describes the circle of security. which we found really helpful in terms of thinking about attachment relationships and what are children's needs as they go out to explore on what the folks call the top of the circle, and as they come back into the secure base of being with their family and caregivers, when they just need to be, get a hug or share feelings that may be overwhelming, etc. And as we know, part of what I think is beautiful about the circle of security is that it's universal. And it also applies, even though they started this out as an early intervention model, it really applies to all ages and stages of life. And it applies to us as adults when we're in situations where we are very stressed out. We turn to our attachment system, which will hopefully be a good friend, a partner, somebody that we can reach out to. And of course, that's been one of the things that's been harder for some folks with COVID because of social isolation. Then we covered basic principles of child development that we pulled into a text box for easy reference. And it includes principles such as knowing that the pace of development is more rapid in the first 3 years of life than at any other time. Honoring differences. I think this already came up in the chat. In each child as their own development unfolds, we know there's a great deal of variation. And realizing that mastering key developmental tasks at each stage build upon each other. We then go on to consider how trauma can disrupt or derail development. And so as an example, many of you may have already experienced this. I know I certainly have, but in working with families with young children who are experiencing or have experienced domestic violence, we may find that the young child is meeting all of their motor milestones and they seem curious to explore, and they do seem connected to their protective caregiver, but they may be experiencing delays in speech and language development. So I think, again, this not only kind of gives basic knowledge, but then we tied in with some practical resources. Okay, now I see an issue maybe I'm concerned about as a staff person, but the parent or caregiver isn't bringing this to my attention or doesn't seem to be concerned about it. So when we encounter those situations, it's really helpful to have some guidance on how to engage in sensitive conversations with parents, including issues related to their child's behavior, their trauma responses, and their child's unfolding development. And so we make reference in this section to our center's guide for engaging and supporting parents, and there's a link to that. Because again, I think for any of us, when we're in a parenting or caregiving role, when something is amiss with one of our children or with our child, it can really evoke strong feelings in us, and we can feel inadequate. And so when you layer on that domestic violence and having been the recipient of harsh criticism by your abusive partner, it can make it really more difficult and sensitive to talk about these issues. So we're giving you tools for that as well. We also heard over the years and from the implementation sites that we worked with that advocates working with adult survivors who are parenting don't always feel like they have the information at their fingertips on what to expect at various ages and stages in a child's ongoing development. So, and I think for all of us, my daughter is now 23. Honestly, I'd have to look back at charts and resources to know what specific milestones to look at age 3, etc. So you're going to have resources on physical and motor milestones, learning and cognitive growth, and social and emotional development. We also offer several handouts within the toolkit, and then have a fairly comprehensive annotated list of resources to learn more about child development. And in the critical conversations towards the end of this section, we invite individual staff or teams to explore how they might offer developmental guidance to caregivers using these handouts and the other resources. And of course, always maintaining cultural humility and exploring how what we're offering might fit with the parent or caregiver's own beliefs, practices, and expectations. We also include information on the adverse childhood experiences study that was initiated over 25 years ago between the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente healthcare system in California. And many of you are familiar with this. So these experiences include domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, parental mental health conditions, and parental substance use, to name most of them. And the findings that they came up with reveal how common ACEs, so-called ACEs, are, and how these experiences can impact our overall health and well-being as we grow and develop and as adults. We also provide data in this section from some of the newer studies that are more inclusive of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and LGBTQ+ folks and communities. And we introduce a graphic to broaden our understanding of how social conditions, including racism, discrimination, and oppressive practices within the context of historical, collective, and ongoing trauma, impact overall stress and health over our lifetime. And in particular, as we're looking at this resource and across generations. And then finally, because there's a lot packed into this section, we also introduce the SAS framework, which is a resiliency-based approach to help guide our practice and support protective caregivers in fostering resilience and healing for their children and themselves. And some of you are familiar with this. SAS is an acronym that stands for safety, attachment, self-regulation, and self-esteem/self-agency. These components are all interrelated, and our starting point is always supporting physical and emotional felt safety first. This is a component that we may need to revisit with families over and over again as various changes occur in custody arrangements and when families experience additional adversities and losses. We've certainly seen a lot of that with COVID. So this part of the section gives some specific ways in which we can support caregivers and their children. And some of what's suggested here is deepened and enriched in section 12, which introduces activities that caregivers and their children can engage in. And as I mentioned earlier, so we have the critical conversations at the end of the section to invite us to take a lot of this information and really sift it through and apply it to our work. We also offer a vignette about a younger child who's being aggressive towards his 2-year-old sister and what that evokes in the mother and in us and how we might respond to this situation. So again, I think there's a lot jam-packed in here, and it's a section that staff may want to refer back to depending on what's coming up. Okay. So I mentioned this before. We know how important attachment relationships are to help scaffold children's ongoing development. And we also know that domestic violence and other stressors and adversities and losses can really disrupt attachment relationships. We know in particular with domestic violence that the protective parent may be prevented from consistently nurturing and picking up or soothing or comforting their child by their abusive partner and by an atmosphere of tension, fear, and control that kind of permeates the caregiving environment. And so, of course, that's going to affect the parent-child relationship. It also, as we know, and it's pretty understandable, can have a real impact on the parent's sense of confidence in their own parenting capacity, in their competence as a parent, And so much energy is going into just surviving and trying to keep their children as safe as they can. So there's a lot of depletion. So we look at that, and we also look at dilemmas that staff may struggle with in terms of holding both a caregiver and the child and teen in mind at the same time, because they may have different needs and agendas that come up. Okay, so going on to, okay. So on this slide, Jeannette and I are really inviting you to tell us about what behavioral issues or mental health concerns come up in your work with children, teens, and families before we go on to our next section. So what comes up for you commonly? What are you seeing? What do parents bring to you? What are you observing? What are some of the main issues? Okay, Desiree, thank you, says children hitting, cussing. Yeah, so hitting, yelling, Melissa, swearing. I don't have to listen to you. So a lot of dysregulation going on, right? And of course, we know when kids are dysregulated, then that is dysregulating for us as caregivers, right? And we talk a lot about how domestic violence itself can put us off balance, and that it's harder then to be able to be a kind of calming presence for our child or children in the moment when this is going on. Yeah, thank you for those comments. Anything else? Okay, and Patricia's talking about what happens when there are disclosures with Child Protective Services involvement and how to handle that. We have some on that. Yeah, trouble focusing, blaming a parent for leaving, and the children having those mixed loyalties. Yes, I appreciate that. Not having enough attention to go around. Children feeling isolated. Yeah. Teens not wanting to come for sessions. Yeah. Yes, and thanks for bringing that up in terms of the parents' mental health. And we will be talking about that next time, and we really address that in one of our sections in section 10. Yeah, and those kids, Melissa's talking about those kids that are really clingy and have trouble separating. Yeah, and Mutal's talking about a lot of sibling rivalry. Excellent. Great. Okay. Let's see where we are next here. We are at our stretch break. All right. So we will take 5 minutes. We hope you enjoy your time off. Stretch a little bit, get hydrated. Yeah, and I see Bessie put another comment in, which I think are really important. Fears losing family. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we will see you back in, and let me just look at, I've got 2:08 now, so we will be back, that's Central Time, sorry. We will be back at 13 minutes after the hour, wherever you are. Thanks. Okay, see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. No, that may have felt short, but we're going to go on. Give you a moment to gather. Really appreciated what people sent to us into the chat around what you're seeing as problems and issues. And Jeanette's going to pick up on what we have in section 7. So Jeannette, when you're ready, I am going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about section 7. So just quickly, before our stretch break, some of you identified a few topic areas that we have covered in the toolkit. So we have sections on aggressive behaviors, when children are dysregulated and hitting and yelling, right? There's a section on addressing anxiety and depression. And then even section 8, which Susan will cover later on, in terms of working with teenagers, dealing with grief and loss. So we also have that addressed. So thank you for sharing your comments in the chat. So we started section 7 by really highlighting a collaborative approach to understanding how children and teens' behaviors might be related to their experiences and trauma responses. And so sometimes we might find ourselves without clear guidance on how to respond to emotional distress or crisis, or even mental health related challenges, right, that might come up with the children and families we're serving. So section 7 provides some best practice suggestions in terms of offering direct services. And so Susan and I really believe that partnering with survivors, caregivers as allies is a best practice for dealing with some of the challenges that come up. Obviously, every family situation is unique, but we can be really thoughtful in how best to respond to survivors and their children. And we may want to start by exploring who's experiencing the distress, who's concerned, right, about those behaviors. Is it the parent, a teacher? Is it the advocate within the organization, right? So we want to understand children's behaviors and what's the meaning of those behaviors, and stay really curious, right, and non-judgmental, right? So we want to be asking questions and ask the survivor about their concerns for their child. And also we want to check in with the child or teen and ask them about their perspective as well. Section 7 also provides some guidance on identifying mental health needs of children and teens and when to consider referrals for mental health services. We recognize that some domestic violence and sexual assault programs have therapists in-house, and others are utilizing and partnering with community-based programs. And so we share information on researched trauma-informed treatment approaches that we can look for when we are making out-of-agency referrals. So this section also includes some specific guidance on issues and concerns that come up frequently in our work with children and teens impacted by domestic violence. So the next slide gives a little bit more detail specific to topics that are covered. So these are really the issues that are explored in section 7 as they relate to children and teens. So really talking through aggressive and destructive behaviors. And so that was something that came up in chat. I think that was maybe the first thing that came up, right? And how we can be addressing that. And so I just want to say it's important to really note that this toolkit is a resource for advocates without a mental health background or extensive training, as well as for beginning master's level mental health clinicians. And so we give a lot of information on anxiety disorder, what major depression is, but also just gives some of the symptoms that may signal that, so that it is easy to access for folks to understand. We also cover suicidal thoughts and intent, and responding to risks of suicide. And we address self-harming behaviors. We also address child sexual abuse and problematic sexual behaviors, and the issue of psychiatric medications. So we also, we wanted to give enough information in the toolkit, prompts and resources, extensive resources, to help everyone feel confident in identifying potential concerns and in supporting the families that you all are working with. We also are very encouraging that ongoing reflective supervision supports the staff in working with families, whether that's support from program managers or clinical supervisors. This section also includes the process of making referrals, so out of agency referrals, and walking through the referral process and helping to really sort through what choices and options for support may be available for the family. And this, of course, is going to vary between communities and what resources are really available. So let's share some more details from section 7. All right, so we often hear concerns about aggressive behavior in children and teens. Caregivers who have experienced domestic violence may express fears or other strong feelings about their children's aggressive behaviors. So we offer some guiding principles for how to respond, from taking steps to intervening and how to stop the behavior, to also supporting caregivers in taking action, and then helping family members, the child and the caregiver, to express and process their feelings. We encourage using a developmentally sensitive and trauma-informed lens to better understand those aggressive behaviors in the context of the child's experience and their age. We really want to help caregivers and children build skills for self-regulation and how to manage their stress responses. So we offer items to really consider when making mental health referrals. For example, considering potential delays in social emotional development of the child, maybe some difficulties with their daily functioning, difficulties with sleeping, changes in their eating patterns, difficulty concentrating, in school. We offer some questions to help us select mental health providers in our communities when making referrals. Things that we can ask, like, are the mental health providers trauma informed? Are they providing a trauma specific therapy? Do the mental health providers routinely include the non-offending parent, the survivor, in the counseling process? The toolkit also offers some warning signs in terms of dealing with self-harming behaviors and tips for approaching conversations with children and teens that are doing self-injury, and ways to approach it in a real non-judgmental manner, asking things like, how do you feel before? How do you feel after you self-injure? What's it like for you to talk about hurting yourself? So the toolkit offers guidance on responding to child sexual abuse disclosures and how to involve the protective caregiver if possible. So we offer some guidance on making mandated reports to child welfare and connecting the family to local child advocacy centers for a forensic interview and trauma-specific services in coordination with legal services. And again, recognizing that some of those resources and referrals may vary depending on the community that you are in. So the toolkit also offers some suggestions on addressing problematic sexual behavior, especially for those of you who might be working in residential programs. We recognize the importance of identifying problematic sexual behaviors and responding to children and teens who are living in domestic violence shelters, and also within community settings if you're running groups. So there's some step-by-step guidance on addressing this. We've also included information on warning signs and risks for suicidal ideation. Similar to other sections, we have tons of resources and links to further delve into these topics. We're actually going to explore section 7 a little more by looking at a vignette from this section. But first, Susan, I think we have like a little brain break built in here, maybe. Yeah. So just a moment to take a brief pause here and give ourselves a little break. Check out the sweet little baby calf. Take a stretch, maybe take a deeper breath or a drink of water. And then turning things back over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Jeanette. So that was a lot. So what we're going to do next is talk a little bit about how you might consider using vignettes from the toolkit within your program. So this slide really kind of sets the stage for us to think about this. And what we would encourage you to do after you've gotten familiar with the toolkit, and it is a large toolkit, so we assume you're going to skim through it, find parts that are interesting to you, although some of you may want to read it cover to cover, online, cover to cover. So one thing to consider would be to select a part and have either individual staff members or your whole team review a particular part within a section or the full section and kind of treat it like a book club before you apply the vignette, before you think about applying the vignette. And as you know, this is one of the repeating sections through repeating elements throughout the sections. And we hope that it's going to prompt and introduce some discussion for new ideas and for further exploration in terms of what are we bringing to this work on this particular topic and working with this child or family. And also an invitation for staff to go deeper on a particular topic that you know, when I think about some of the topics that Jeannette just reviewed, and we're going to be talking about suicidal ideas and intent in a minute, it can be a little overwhelming. And I do think it takes preparation. We know from advocates across the country that these issues come up. And so how can you get to a point where you're going to feel some sense of confidence in handling these situations when they come up? And because you're really the first person or persons or program that's maybe hearing about this. And so you have a really important role to play in terms of engaging around all of this. And I think that one of the hopes that Jeannette and I have about this toolkit is that staff won't and programs won't reflexively just refer people out. Oh, suicide. I can't handle that. Let's get, you know, somebody either within some other part of our agency or somebody else to, you know, and we're not saying that you should not have expertise and support on this, but we really want to encourage you to prepare yourselves to meet some of the challenges and issues that you're going to face. And then the vignette is also like a mini training opportunity to integrate what you've read and learned about and thought about in terms of the families you worked with before and ways to put that into practice. And as we talked about in part one, each of the vignettes is accompanied by things to consider and then what you can do. And so with that, we are going to look at the vignette that actually is in section 7 that Jeannette just reviewed for us. And I'm going to read this out loud and we'll go from there. So this vignette is about Marcus, who's 12. And Marcus and his mother receive services through your program. Marcus talks frequently about being lonely and dying. He has recently started threatening suicide, quote, to get what he wants, according to his mother. Yesterday, he refused to log into his online school. And his mother tells you that she didn't argue with him this time because she's wondering if he might follow through with his threats. So that's the vignette. And one of the ways that we think might be a way to approach a vignette like this after folks have read through this section and or have read through the part on suicidal intent, ideas, intent, and risks. To begin by asking everyone on the team, and so we're going to invite you into this process now to put yourself in this situation. So you may be an advocate, you may be a mental health counselor within a domestic violence program, or you may be a supervisor or administrator. So what feelings or reactions get invoked in you? So we're going to pause this. Just take a minute to think about, you heard this vignette. What comes up for you? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are your ideas? And so we're going to open up the chat to hear your responses. I assume you're thinking. So does someone want to get us started? So there's, it's a short vignette, but there are a lot of strands to it. There are a lot of pieces, right? We have a 12-year-old. And, in our integrated approach, we're thinking developmentally. So Virginia asks, is he a resident? So let's assume then that they're in a shelter-based program. They don't have to be, okay? But you can apply it, think about it in terms of your own program setting or settings, domestic violence settings. So in an integrated approach, we want to be trauma responsive. We want to think about this developmentally in terms of Marcus's age. And we want to think about how do we work with his mother and child together? And it doesn't mean we won't separate and have separate contacts, but thinking about it from a family-based perspective. So Bianca says, validate mother's feelings. Yes, absolutely. She may be scared and concerned. So she went from kind of implying that Marcus was being quote unquote manipulative. We might read that into this, right? But now she's concerned. What else came up? Thank you, Bianca, for sharing that. Anybody else? Did you feel anything in your stomach or wherever you feel, tension or stress when you read this, imagining yourself in this situation or supporting a staff member in this situation? It's tough, and people may be feeling, how many of you are feeling like you're unsure as to how you might approach it? Okay, so Amy's saying, following up on what Bianca said, do the same for Marcus and offer to sit with them both and allow Marcus space to tell his mom about what he's feeling. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so Virginia says, encourage mom to ask more questions. Okay, and Desiree is saying she's feeling a little unsure. And I can only think they need to go to family counseling. Okay, yeah, definitely validate mom's feelings. And Patricia's saying, and think a little further with them about, whoops, I'm just losing the chat for a second there. Has he actually thought through? Is there some intent? He's been verbalizing this. And Carrie's saying referrals to, whoops, wait a minute, referrals to get some mental health support for if that isn't. So let's assume it's not happening yet. Well, you're the front line. You're hearing about this. Bessie's saying, don't ever take suicide remarks for granted. Staff should have a staffing with others involved with the family, yeah, to get some guidance as to how to move forward. Patricia's saying both individual and family counseling. So all really excellent thoughts and ideas. So in demonstrating this from section 7, we would, if I were doing this with my team, I think I would ask folks to start with what their own thoughts, reactions, and ideas were. And for some of us, if we've had a recent loss, or if someone that we have been close to has died by suicide, it may also have another valence for us when this is coming up, right? Yeah. Bianca has another comment. Talk to Marcus one-on-one, look at risk factors, work to increase protective. Excellent, yes, and safety planning. Wonderful. Okay, so in some of our vignettes have longer things to consider and what you can do sections. This is a somewhat longer one, especially because it's dealing with suicidal ideation. So I've just taken this directly from the toolkit. And you can see the kinds of things that we're inviting staff to consider. And as most of us know, I think for most of us, that when we have a little distance of looking at a situation that's not going on for us currently, that we can get some perspective and maybe think a little more creatively. And so in discussing this vignette together, we offer some things that are pretty similar to what some of you already offered in the chat. So, just the beginning part, have Marcus and his mother talked about this? Kind of feel from the vignette that they probably haven't. And what exactly is he saying? And then really trying to tease out, is he telegraphing his distress, or is he trying to get out of going to school? And really stepping back from this and thinking about how can mom help support Marcus, and how can we be a support, no matter what the situation is, right? So if he's trying to get out of going to school, then what's that about, right? And again, you'll see in this section, or the part within this section, that we have a lot of prompts and warning signs, as Jeannette was talking about. And so, people can review some of that. But we'd want to know more about Marcus's daily life, depending on how long we've known this family and what's been going on. And when did some of these thoughts and ideas about dying and feeling very lonely start? Did it start with COVID and some of that increased isolation, or has this been going on for a while and it's just gotten worse? So really putting some historical context into this so that we can understand what might be going on for Marcus. And So when he has these thoughts or feelings, how does he cope? I mean, we know in the vignette that he's refusing to log on for his schooling. That was, we're going to assume, was online as opposed to an option to go to school in person. So how does he cope with that? And then, is there any family or community context with someone who has threatened suicide, made an attempt, or died by suicide? Did a close family member appear to die recently? Not necessarily by suicide, but was there a death and a loss? And is that part of what's going on? And certainly when we have that empathic conversation with mom, we can probe a little more in terms of her own recent or past history, and what might be coming up for her when she's hearing this from her son. So we want to, a lot of you talked about individual and family work. So we want to learn more about the relationship between Marcus and his mother. Are they in a power struggle? That would not be uncommon in a kid who's in a developmental stage, identified as a tween, right? That's such a hard age for kids. So are there ways, we talk a lot within the toolkit on ways to support regulation, co-regulation, soothing. So are there ways for them to both identify and communicate their needs when they're not in the moment, meaning when things aren't kind of heated up? So those are some of the things that we put out there that might lead to some interesting conversations and staff sharing what their own experiences have been in terms of working with families where this may have come up. Or if they haven't, what do they feel they need to be prepared? So that leads us to what you can do. And this is a summary. I don't think it has everything in there, but you all were on this. So begin by empathizing with mom's distress. And I think it's helpful to provide some psychoeducation about suicide and suicidal risks, because there are these myths that are floating out there, where parents may think, if we talk about it, then that's going to increase his risk of actually acting on the things that he's talking about. And so we try to dispel that myth. So that's really important in this section. Also, we talk about the fact in this section earlier on about the fact that no suicide contracts. So, make a contract with me that you're not going to hurt yourself or harm yourself by making a suicide plan. We found that actually the field has found that those are not helpful. We wouldn't, that's not a best practice. Actually, it can lead to more risk, because if we assume that the contract is really going to help, then we might sort of have our guard down. But what is helpful is to think together with Marcus and his mother about, depending on what you learn, about making a safety or crisis response plan. And we have lots of resources, as Jeannette said, we have national resources and guidance around what that might look like. And if Marcus is engaged in some kind of counseling, to see if he can commit to making a pledge not to harm himself. And again, that goes back into, by suicide, that goes back into safety planning. And by the way, in this section, I just want to digress for a minute. We do distinguish between self-harm and suicidal ideation and intent, because they're very different. And so I just wanted to note that. So again, this is always organic, but depending on what happens, you talk to mom first, explore things with her, see what her situation is, what's coming up for her, and then bring them together, because this may be the first time that they've talked about this. As I said, you want to review the materials, and depending on what you're hearing, you can acknowledge your concern or share your observations. And again, there's lots of information, resources, and support. And one of the things that we stress in this section is before you hand this off, if you're very concerned that Marcus is really high risk, before you hand this off to somebody outside of your center for a mental health evaluation or for crisis counseling, etc., we encourage you, if you've got a relationship with Marcus or Marcus and his mother, to stay with the family so that it doesn't feel like you're passing them on to somebody else who can help because whatever you can offer won't be helpful, so that you maintain some continuity with them, and that you're there as a touchstone for them. And then, and this came up in the chat, we would suggest that you can ask Marcus if it would be helpful to him to meet with you or another coworker who might have an established relationship with him privately. And again, you'll see what comes out there. There may be some things that he would feel more comfortable talking with a staff member about than in front of his mother. And then this also came up in the chat, so that when we do have a red flag or a yellow, strong yellow flag about suicidal risk or intent, that you would want to consult with your supervisor and trusted peers to share your concerns and to review any planning steps and to follow your program policies and protocols. And if you don't have these in place yet or haven't really thought about that, we encourage you to do so, because this may come up. Right. So before we go on, actually, I think Jeannette will probably move on to our Q&A section. And we can both have our mics open. And we would just encourage you now to give us some reflections. What did you think about the walkthrough of the sections that we covered today? What are you taking with you? What are you thinking about? Does anybody want to share any takeaways of what you're feeling about what we are covering in the toolkit, or reactions? Jeannette, I don't know if you have something you want to add.
Or any questions? Yeah, questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you all. Thank you all for participating in the walkthrough of the vignette. We were hoping that people would find that helpful as a way to take some of the content, and it might spark some conversations.
I guess I'd be curious to know. Well, let's see, there are some comments coming up, Jeannette.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Melissa's asking, is there a book on this? I was not here for your first group. So we have a toolkit that has recently been launched. It feels like a book. It's pretty content heavy, but lots of great resources are in there. And so it is available on the National Center's website to download and to utilize.
And Carla did put the link into the chat, and we'll give it to you again to get to this resource that has all of this. So it looks like we have some other comments too from Patricia and Cheryl about really liking this process of using the vignettes and things to consider and what to do. Great. Yeah.
So each of the sections of the toolkit has a vignette. And I think really we wanted to offer those as, I mean, just as a prompt, right, to introduce new ideas. You could use it for a staffing, just even to invite any type of discussion to go through it. So glad that it was helpful.
And we really built the content, not only of all the years that Jeannette and I have worked in the field and worked with advocates and counselors across the country, but from what we heard from the 6 implementation sites that you'll hear a little more from. We have a panel next time too. And so we hope, obviously we haven't covered everything that there is out there. Today we didn't actually talk about another section, which is section 8, that has special topics and how to offer more inclusive services. So that's in there as well. Anything else? We hope we've built some excitement about the toolkit, actually. So Jeannette, should I go on to the next, or do you want to wait for a few more, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, sure. Sure. We could talk about what's coming up in November. Not sure how it's November already next week, but so our preview for our third and last webinar for launching this toolkit will be next week on November 3rd, same time. And we will be discussing primarily the sections which focus on engaging and supporting caregivers. And we'll be talking about the activities and how to use the activities to strengthen parent and child relationships. So we will also have a panel discussion with domestic violence supervisors and program staff from New Mexico and the Chicago area that were part of the implementation, what we call the implementation sites, as we were developing the toolkit. So we're really excited to have them with us next time to share their perspectives. And yeah, their participation was invaluable in creating this toolkit. So we're excited to have them be part of our discussion next week.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is that you'll see is when you download the toolkit that we actually have 3 sections on engaging and supporting caregivers that we're going to summarize for you. But this came up today in terms of a parent with mental health needs and issues and how that can create challenges for parenting. And so that's one of the separate sections. And then we have one on working with parents who use substances and working with them and their children. So we hope you will join us for our last introductory webinar in this series. And there is the link again. And Jeannette, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. I was going to say, I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in that discussion with you on the vignette, and to thank everyone for attending today. We hope you can join us next week. Again, same time, same place, right, for part 3. Again, the link is live for the toolkit. So please do check it out. And I believe that Carla has a brief online survey to give us some feedback on today in our webinar. But thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here. Thank you for participating in all the comments.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Carla for doing all the behind the scenes work on this. And we hope she just put up the Survey Monkey. And I think both Jeannette and I will be excited to hear what your reactions are if you join us next time to the toolkit itself. So Thanks again. Great. And with that, Carla, I think
Yes, yes. Thank you, Susan and Jeanette, for today's webinar. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. Within the next week or so, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to the recording, the slides, a link to the toolkit again, and a certificate of attendance. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.